But if you close your eyes.
As you probably noticed when we created our first graph in the last lecture, there are many different types of graphs you can select from. The main categories we see are column, line, pie, bar, area, and scatter. In my experience, there are two types of graphs that you should be most comfortable using. These are column and line. We'll start with the line graph since we saw an example of one in the last lecture. The graph we made was a plain line graph, but another type of line graph you should be aware of is the marked line graph. This type of line graph will put a marker at each data point. For example, I'll create a marked line graph to compare. As you can see, in the marked line graph, there are marks at every data point on the line. There are certain situations where one of these would be more appropriate than the other. Here are some ideas to keep in mind when selecting which line graph to use. If there aren't a lot of data points in your line graph, and it's not a smooth line, as in the points are scattered far apart, then it makes sense to use a marked line graph. You shouldn't use a marked line graph when there are a lot of data points because your graph will become cluttered with the markers. You also don't want to use a marked line graph if your line is smooth because the markers will break up the visual trend you're presenting with your line graph. The other type of graph you need to be comfortable using is a column graph. I'm going to quickly create a column graph the same way we created the line graph so you can see what it looks like. As with the line graph, there are two different types of column graphs that you should be comfortable with. These are the clustered column and the stacked column. These are both good for use when there is more than one metric being displayed in the graph, or when you want to show one metric broken out by more than one variable. You'll want to use the clustered column when there is more than one field being displayed on the graph. For example, if we wanted to show losses and claim count in one column graph, we would select the clustered column and each field would have a set of columns in the graph. Let's create a graph like this to give you a visual. As you can see, there are separate columns in the graph for the losses and the claim counts. On the other hand, you'll want to use the stacked column when you want to show one field broken out by more than one example. Let's say the losses in our dataset are for auto accidents, and we want to show the losses broken out by male and female drivers. The stacked column would then show the amount of losses attributed to males and the amount attributed to females in the same column, but they would be separated so that the male portion of losses would sit on top of the female portion of losses, or vice versa. It will look like the example you see when you click on the drop-down in the Charts ribbon. These four types of graphs are very versatile and enable you to share your findings and insights with your colleagues through an easy-to-follow visual.
But if you close your eyes.